Good evening. Welcome back. Or, if this is your first night here, welcome. You've arrived at a good time. This is the sleepy history of medicine. Long, quiet documentaries about how human beings have tried to heal each other, told slowly in the dark at the pace of a fireside story. You don't have to do anything for the next 2 hours except listen, or drift, or both in turn. Nothing will be on the test. If you fall asleep somewhere between ancient Thebes and a Victorian chemist's shop, you'll have used this exactly as directed. Tonight's subject is a flower. Picture a walled garden at dusk, a physic garden, like the ones we walked through behind the monastery 2 episodes ago. The beds are laid out in neat rectangles, labeled with little lead markers, and the light is going soft and blue at the edges. Most of what grows here is modest. Low herbs, gray-green leaves, plants you would pass without a glance. But in one bed, standing taller than its neighbors, there is a flower you would not pass. Petals like crumpled silk, white, or lilac, or a red that holds the last of the light. And beneath the petals, where the flower has already finished blooming, a smooth green capsule the size of a walnut, standing on its stalk with the calm self-possession of something that knows exactly what it's worth. It is a poppy, and it is, by a very wide margin, the most consequential plant in the history of medicine. If you've been with us from the beginning, you have already brushed against it, again and again, whether you noticed or not. It was there in the Egyptian papyri, in our first episode. It was the one ingredient in Galen's 64-ingredient theriac that actually did anything. It was in the laudanum bottles and the teething syrups. And it was the substance a young pharmacist's assistant named Sir Turner was hunched over at the end of our last episode, in the back room of a German pharmacy. Every thread we have laid down for 2 episodes runs, eventually, through this one garden bed. So tonight we follow the single thread. It is an old story, and in places a heavy one, and we will carry the heavy parts the way a good pharmacist carries them, carefully, at arm's length, with respect and without alarm. Mostly it is a story about people trying to ease pain, which is the oldest job there is. So settle in. Let the garden gate swing shut behind you. The flower has been waiting for about 10,000 years. It can certainly wait while you get comfortable. Chapter 1. The Joy Plant. Begin with the flower itself, because the flower is genuinely strange. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bearing poppy, botany's least mysterious piece of naming, is, for most of its short life, an entirely ordinary garden annual. It sprouts from a seed so small that 100 of them fit on a teaspoon. The same seeds, incidentally, that sit blamelessly on top of your breakfast roll. It grows waist-high, puts out soft, toothed, cabbage-colored leaves and produces one of the loveliest flowers in cultivation. 4 petals of crumpled tissue silk that last only a day or two, as if the plant could not quite believe its own extravagance and thought better of it. Gardeners have grown it for the flower alone for thousands of years. Bakers have grown it for the seeds. It asks for nothing. Poor soil, little water, any temperate sun will do. And then the petals drop, and the strangeness begins. What's left behind is the capsule, that smooth green pod, crowned with a little pleated roof like a pepper pot lid. Inside it, while the seeds ripen, the plant manufactures something found almost nowhere else in nature. A milky latex, thick and white, laced with a family of chemicals that happen to fit with uncanny lock and key precision. Receptors in the human nervous system. The plant, of course, knows nothing of this. The chemistry is its own affair, a defense, most likely, against being eaten. But by pure biochemical coincidence, this one unassuming annual carries within its seed pod the ability to quiet pain, to still a cough, to slow the racing mind, and inseparably, in the same milk, from the same pod, the ability to do great harm, remedy and poison in a single vessel. If you remember one Greek word from our last episode, you remember pharmakon. And you can see why tonight we could hardly talk about anything else. No substance on earth has ever lived inside that word so completely. Humans noticed early, startlingly early. In the 1850s, when Swiss lakes fell during a dry winter, the muddy shallows gave up the remains of prehistoric villages. Houses on wooden piles, preserved in the airless ooze for thousands of years, along with their owners' rubbish, which is the great gift archaeology keeps giving us, other people's kitchens. Among the wheat and the flax and the apple cores, the lake mud held poppy seeds and poppy capsules from cultivated poppies tended on purpose more than 5,000 years ago. Which means the sleep-bearing poppy is not some late arrival to the human story. It was there in the first gardens we ever planted, alongside bread and linen, one of the founding crops of settled life. What those lake dwellers used it for, food, oil, medicine, comfort, some or all of the above, the mud declines to say. Mud is discreet, but they grew it and kept growing it, and it has never once been out of cultivation since. When writing begins, in Mesopotamia, the poppy is, perhaps, already there. And here we owe you the kind of small confession this series enjoys making. If you have ever read an article about opium, and the internet is thickly sown with them, you have probably met the claim that the ancient Sumerians called the poppy hul gil the joy plant 5,000 years ago. It's a wonderful detail. It is on posters and in textbooks, and it has opened 1,000 documentaries, though not, you'll notice, this one. Because when Assyriologists, the people who actually read cuneiform for a living, went back to the tablets, the story wobbled. The reading is disputed, the tablet is late, not early, and the plant in question may not be the poppy at all. The joy plant, in other words, Maybe a joy mirage. One of those facts too pleasing to check. We've met its cousins before, the smoke that wasn't blown. In our first episode, the quote that wasn't said. Tonight we simply set it, gently, on the shelf of stories too good to be true, and note the honest version underneath. Mesopotamian medicine knew and used a great many plants. The poppy was moving through the ancient Near East in this period. Of that, the archaeology is confident. And somebody in some language surely had an affectionate name for it. We just can't prove it was that one. In Egypt, the trail firms up underfoot. Egyptian doctors whose papyri we leafed through in our very first episode knew the poppy well. The great Eber's papyrus, that 70-foot scroll of 800 remedies, includes it among its ingredients, and one use in particular has become famous. The poppy given, as we noted in our first episode, to soothe crying children. The most quoted version of the prescription pairs it, in the Egyptian manner, with an ingredient from a wasp, and directs it be strained and given for 4 days to quiet a child who cries too much. We'll say now what we said then, at the same careful distance. It almost certainly worked, which is exactly the trouble. And generations of exhausted parents across the next 4,000 years would reach for versions of that same remedy. A bottle of it will be waiting for us, with a Victorian label on it, a few chapters from now. The Egyptians were not casual about such things. Their prescriptions came with doses and durations, and their poppies came, increasingly, from serious cultivation. In the later classical world, the poppy fields around Thebes were famous enough that a preparation of Egyptian opium was named for the city, Thebacum. And to this day, one of the minor chemicals in the poppy's milk carries the name thebaine. There are worse monuments. Most cities get a cathedral. Thebes got a molecule. But it was the Greeks, the same Greeks who gave us the word pharmakon, who told us, without meaning to, exactly what they thought this plant was. They told us in their myths, which is where the ancient world kept its filing system. Consider where the poppy appears. Nyx, the goddess of night, wears a crown of poppies. Her son Hypnos, the god of sleep, carries them. His quiet house, the poet said, was surrounded by them, nodding at the door. Hypnos has a twin brother, Thanatos, death. The two of them so alike in the Greek imagination that they are often shown as mirrored figures, one dark, one pale, both crowned in poppies. And Hypnos, in turn, has a son, Morpheus, the god of dreams, the shaper of the visions that visit sleeping minds. Poppies again, always poppies, at every bedside in the family. Sleep, death, night, and dreams. That is the entire mythological address of this flower. The Greeks had gods of healing, remember? We spent a whole chapter with Asclepius and his temples in our first episode, and they did use the poppy in medicine. We'll watch them do it, carefully, in the next chapter. But when they reached for meaning, they did not file the poppy under healing. They filed it under night, under the family of things that come for us gently in the dark and take us somewhere else. It is as clear-eyed a label as any pharmacy has ever written. 4,000 years before anyone isolated a single alkaloid, The myth-makers had already understood that this plant's gift and its danger were the same thing. It does not cure you of anything. It carries you away. And one of those divine names, of course, is waiting at the far end of our story. When that young German pharmacist's assistant, 18 chapters of history from now and one episode behind us, finally coaxed the poppy's secret into pure white crystals, he reached back past all the kings and all the chemists and named his discovery for the god of dreams. Morphine. The myth got there first. The chemistry just confirmed it. So the ancient world, by its close, holds the poppy in both hands. In one hand, a garden crop, a seed for bread, a medicine with doses and instructions, a famous export of Egyptian fields. In the other, a flower belonging to night and her children, approached with a respect shading into wariness. Both hands at once. It is, you'll notice, the oldest posture in the series, and nobody would hold the poppy more thoughtfully or write about it more precisely than the Greek and Roman physicians we meet next. A man who described how to gather the poppy's milk with the care of a jeweler, and another who fed it to emperors. The ancients are about to stop telling myths about this plant and start writing prescriptions. Chapter 2. The Juice. Every so often, a drug's name tells you everything about how it was made. This is one of those times. The Greek word for the poppy's product was opium, and opium means simply juice. Little juice, in fact, the diminutive. That is the entire etymology of the most storied drug name on earth. Not dream bringer, not pain ender, not anything a marketing department would have chosen. Juice. Because that is what it is. The milky sap of the poppy capsule, collected drop by drop, dried into a resin. The ancients were capable of tremendous poetry about this plant, as we heard last chapter. They gave its flower to the gods of night and dreams. But when the poets stepped aside and the professionals stepped up, the professionals called it what it was, with the flat practicality that has marked pharmacy labels ever since. The most consequential substance in the history of medicine is named the way a farmer names a barn cat. The Greek doctors used it the way they named it, practically, and with a certain deliberate calm. In the Hippocratic writings, that sprawling library of texts we dipped into in our first episode, some by Hippocrates, most by the students of students, the poppy appears here and there among the remedies, for sleeplessness, in soothing drinks, in preparations for the diseases of women. What's striking is how unstriking the mentions are. No awe, no warnings in capital letters, just one useful ingredient among hundreds, listed between honey and hellebore, dosed and moved past. The Hippocratics, you'll remember, were the great de-dramatizers of medicine. Diseases came from nature, not from angry gods. and remedies were tools, not magic. Filing the poppy quietly among the tools was, in its way, the whole Hippocratic program in miniature. The plant of Hypnos and Thanatos entered in the ledger between the vinegar and the barley water. The Greeks also left us, in their oldest poetry, the most tantalizing drug reference in ancient literature, and since it sits at the border of myth and medicine, this is its chapter. In the Odyssey, Helen of Troy, entertaining guests heavy with grief, slips into their wine a drug called nepenthe, no sorrow, which banishes grief and anger for a day. And Homer adds the detail that makes historians of pharmacy sit up straight. She had it from Egypt, where he says the fertile earth bears drugs in abundance, and every man is a physician. Was nepenthe opium? Readers have guessed so for 2,000 years, and the guess is a good one. An Egyptian drug, dissolved in wine, that quiet sorrow is not a long list of candidates. But Homer wrote poetry, not prescriptions, and we will leave nepenthe where he left it. Unidentified, Egyptian, and working. What the passage proves is not what the drug was, but what the Greeks already believed in the 8th century BC, that for the heaviest sorrows there might be something in a cup, and that the people who would know were the Egyptians whose poppy fields we visited last chapter. The rumor of relief, you might say, arrived in Greece before the botany did. Theophrastus, Aristotle's student and the ancient world's great botanist, described the poppy and its juice around 300 BC with a botanist's patience. And as Greek medicine ripened into its Roman centuries, the descriptions kept getting better, more exact, more careful, more like the label copy on a modern bottle, until, in the 1st century of our era, they arrived at the man who wrote the finest drug descriptions of the entire ancient world. We met Dioscorides 2 episodes ago, the army surgeon who marched with Roman legions and botanized his way across the Mediterranean, and whose 5-volume De Materia Medica would remain the standard drug reference of Western civilization for 1,500 years. It is worth pausing on that number again. Not 15 decades, 15 centuries. There are students today whose textbooks go out of date before they graduate. Dioscorides stayed current from the reign of Nero to the age of the printing press. And of all the 600 plants in his great book, few get more careful treatment than the poppy. Dioscorides describes how the juice is gathered, in the cool of the day, from the capsule, with a patience he clearly respects. And he does something more impressive. He tells you how to spot the fakes. True opium, he says, has a particular heavy scent. The adulterated article, cut with lettuce juice or gum, even in the 1st century the cutting had already begun, betrays itself to the trained nose and eye. You may remember this reflex from our apothecary episode. Dioscorides was teaching the tests, the ancient version of asking a substance, politely but firmly, "Are you really what your label says you are?" With no substance did that question matter more, and he knew it, because he also wrote down, plainly and without flinching, the other half. A little, he says, eases pain and brings sleep. Too much does harm, and more than that ends a life. He states it the way he states everything. as a property of the material, like the color of a flower or the season of a harvest, and then he moves on to the next plant. It is, when you think about it, the most honest drug label ever written, and it is 19 centuries old. Everything the modern world would eventually print in small type on the side of a bottle, Dioscorides said in 3 sentences, in the tone of a man describing weather. This is what it does. All of what it does. Plan accordingly. And then there is Galen, because in this series, there is always, eventually, Galen. You know him by now. Physician to emperors, author of a small library, the man whose kitchen of compounded remedies we toured in the apothecary episode, and whose name still sits quietly inside the word Galenical. Galen's relationship to the poppy ran through the most famous preparation of his age. Theriac, that majestic, preposterous compound of dozens of ingredients aged like wine, reserved for emperors and the wealthy, which we first met in episode 1 as the 64-ingredient cure for everything. We said it plainly enough in episode 1. Theriac contained opium, real opium, in a real dose, and tonight that line gets its full weight. Of all those dozens of ingredients, the viper's flesh, the rare resins, the herbs from 3 continents, the one doing the discernible work, the reason the emperor felt calmer and slept easier after his daily dose, was the opium. 1 ingredient out of 60-some. The rest was theater. Magnificent, expensive, deeply reassuring theater, arranged around a core of poppy juice. Galen served that daily dose to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself, and, as we described in our first episode, adjusted it with real skill, enough that the most burdened man in the world could sleep, not so much that it dulled him. And when the Emperor found it made him drowsy at his duties, the dose came down. It may be the first well-documented case in history of a physician carefully managing a powerful sedative for a patient over years. Titration, we called it then, and the word still fits. Whatever else one says about theriac, at the very top of Roman society, the poppy was being handled with something like modern care. Elsewhere, it was simply being handled. Roman households kept poppy preparations the way later households would keep laudanum, for pain, for coughs, for the long nights. The poppy grew in Roman gardens and appeared on Roman coins. Somnus, the Roman hypnos, kept his crown of capsules. And the Roman world, like the Greek, mostly declined to panic about any of it. They knew what it was. Their own word for the wariness was already on file. Pharmacon, remedy and poison. The word we keep returning to because the ancients kept returning to it. The poppy was the word made visible, and they treated it accordingly, with use, and with respect, and without much drama. It is worth saying clearly what the ancient world had achieved by the time it closed, because we are about to watch much of it be forgotten and slowly relearned. By the end of the classical era, medicine possessed an accurate botanical description of the poppy, a sound method for collecting and testing its juice, a clear, written understanding that the same substance eased pain at one amount and ended life at another, and worked examples of careful, adjusted, long-term dosing. That is not a bad summary of safe practice, and it was on the shelf, in Dioscorides, in Galen, before the year 200. What the ancient world did not have was anywhere to keep all this safe. When Rome's libraries burned or moldered, the poppy's careful instruction manual moldered with them. In Western Europe, the centuries after Rome would keep the plant, but lose much of the precision. The monastery gardens we visited last episode grew poppies among their simples, and the infirmarians used them. But the great systematic pharmacy of Dioscorides and Galen survived mostly as fragments and copies of copies. The full library went east. It was translated, argued with, tested, and improved in a city we have visited before. A city of paper mills and hospitals and the world's first true pharmacies, where the poppy would be weighed out by licensed professionals and written up by the most influential physicians of the medieval world. The juice was about to get its second civilization. Chapter 3. The Physicians of Baghdad. If this chapter feels like returning to a favorite room, that's because it is. We spent a happy quarter of an hour in the golden age of Islamic medicine during our apothecary episode. 8th century Baghdad, the round city on the Tigris, with its house of wisdom and its paper mills, its hospitals with wards and pharmacies attached, and its saidala, the drug shops that were licensed, inspected, and staffed by a new kind of professional who was neither physician nor merchant, but something in between. The pharmacist, present at his own creation. Tonight we walk back into that same city, but we go straight to one particular jar on the shelf, because the physicians of the Islamic Golden Age gave the poppy the most thorough professional examination it had received anywhere, and their conclusions would set its course for the next 500 years. Begin with the books, because Baghdad always began with the books. The Great Translation Movement. Greek medicine carried into Arabic, often by way of Syriac. By salaried scholars working from manuscripts hunted across 3 continents, brought Dioscorides and Galen to the Tigris in full. Everything the ancient world had learned about the poppy, everything we heard last chapter, the harvest, the tests for purity, the honest 3-sentence label, arrived intact, was copied beautifully, and then received the treatment that Golden Age scholarship gave everything. It was checked. Al-Razi raises to the Latin West, the great clinician we met last episode, the man who ran hospitals in Baghdad and wrote the first careful description of smallpox, kept case notes the way modern doctors keep charts. In his enormous notebooks, opium appears as a working tool for pain that nothing else would touch, for the cough that tears sleep apart, for the patient who simply must rest to have any chance at all. And it appears with judgment attached. This much helps, this much clouds, the very old always need less. He was not copying Galen, he was checking Galen against the ward. Where the ancients had written properties, Al-Razi wrote experience. And then, A generation or two later came the man who organized everything. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose canon of medicine would rule the medical schools of both the Islamic world and Christian Europe into the 17th century, gave opium its formal, systematic entry. He called it the most powerful of the stupefacient, the substances that quiet sensation, and his account reads like a synthesis of everything the tradition knew. Its uses for pain, for coughs, for sleeplessness, for the diseases of the gut. Its dangers, stated without decoration, the ways it might be prepared and the ways it might be misjudged. The entry has the quality that makes the canon such strangely restful reading. The calm of a mind that has sorted a difficult subject into order and is showing you the shelves. Here's what it is. Here's what it does. Here's where care is required. For centuries, when a physician in Cordoba or Cairo or eventually Paris wanted to know how to think about opium, this is the page they turned to. And because this was Baghdad, the poppy came under the eye of the inspector. You may remember the muhtasib from our apothecary episode, the market official who patrolled the shops with his manual of tricks and tests, keeping the age's merchants honest. Opium, precious and easily stretched, was exactly the sort of merchandise his manuals dwelt on. The handbooks of market inspection describe the adulterations to watch for and the signs of the true article, its scent, its texture, the way a genuine piece should behave. Descended, recognizably, from the test Dioscorides had taught 8 centuries earlier, now backed by municipal authority. Think about what that means for a moment, because it is quietly momentous. For the first time anywhere, the question, is this opium what it claims to be, was being asked, not just by a careful physician for his own patients, but by the state on behalf of everyone, with penalties attached. The licensed Saydala, the inspected shelf, the tested drug. Every era of the story until now has had to trust the seller. Baghdad was the first to check. The Golden Age did more than study the poppy. It made it, for the first time, genuinely pleasant to take, which is a more important development than it sounds. You may remember from the apothecary episode what Arabic pharmacy did with sugar, the syrups, the juleps, the robs, that whole sweet vocabulary that turned medicine from an ordeal into something a patient might actually finish. Opium was folded into that confectionery revolution. It went into syrups for coughs, into electuaries, those soft honeyed pastes for pain, into carefully compounded theriacs, for the great tradition of imperial cure-alls did not die with Rome. It simply moved east and got better ingredients. The bitter, heavy juice of the poppy, which the ancient world had mixed into wine and hoped for the best, was now dispensed in forms that went down like dessert. Kind, in intention and usually in effect. And as this series says of so many kindnesses, it carried a quiet cost. We will spend later chapters counting. The easier a powerful thing is to take, the easier it is to keep taking. The Golden Age made the poppy palatable. The consequences of palatability were left, like so much else, to the future. But the greatest thing the medieval Islamic world did for the poppy had nothing to do with medicine books. It moved the plant. Baghdad sat at the center of the largest connected trading world humanity had yet built. The Silk Roads running east through Persia and Central Asia, the sea routes stitching the Persian Gulf to India and on to the ports of China. And along those roads, among the silks and the spices and the paper and the faith, went the poppy, as seed, as juice, as medicine, carried in the luggage of a civilization at high tide. Persia took to cultivating it. India took to cultivating it, a fact that will matter enormously and terribly several chapters from now. Hold on to it. And by way of Arab merchants and physicians, the poppy's juice arrived in China, where it entered the medical texts under a name borrowed from the Westerners who brought it, and where physicians of the Tang and Song eras wrote about it exactly as their colleagues in Baghdad did. A medicine. Good for pain, good for coughs, good for the flux. Handle with care. It is worth letting that settle, given where the story goes. Opium arrived in China the way it arrived everywhere, quietly, respectably, in the medicine chest. And it lived there, as a minor and unremarkable drug among thousands in the Chinese pharmacopoeia, for the better part of a millennium. Nothing in this chapter's world hints at what the 19th century will do. The roads that carried the poppy east were the same roads that carried everything else civilizations exchange. And the exchange in this era ran on mutual appetite and mutual profit, and came to rest, mostly, on pharmacy shelves. The poppy now grew from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the valleys of China, planted all along the way by people who wanted its medicine. The map was drawn. What history would eventually route across that map, no one in Baghdad could have imagined. And it is one of the quiet mercies of living inside history, rather than at the end of it, that you cannot see which of your gifts will be turned into weapons. Europe, meanwhile, received all of this the way Europe received most things in those centuries, late, in Latin, and gradually. The canon entered the medical schools. Dioscorides came back west wearing Arabic annotations, and the poppy resumed its place on the European shelf. In the monastery gardens we walked through last episode, in the spiced wine and herb sleeping draughts of the medieval surgeons, in the apothecary shops with their carved dragons and majolica jars. By the close of the Middle Ages, opium was once again what it had been under Rome, a respected, slightly wary entry in the professional's book. What it needed to become the drug of the modern world was a promoter, someone loud, someone with a genius for the memorable phrase and a bottomless contempt for the old authorities, someone who would pull the poppy out of the pharmacopoeia's quiet middle pages and declare it repeatedly at volume all over Europe the greatest remedy on earth, and who would leave its most famous preparation stuck to his name like a burr. Medicine was about to meet its strangest genius, and the poppy was about to meet its press agent. Chapter 4: The Stone of Immortality. We have met Paracelsus before briefly in our first episode. He is the man behind the single most important sentence in the history of pharmacy, the one this series quotes like scripture, "The dose makes the poison." Tonight he gets his full entrance because the strange, stormy, unforgettable Swiss physician who wrote pharmacy's golden rule also, and not coincidentally, carried its most dangerous exception in his saddlebag. Paracelsus, born Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, around 1493, and yes, Bombastus really was in his name, a gift to his critics that keeps giving 5 centuries later, spent his life at war with the medical establishment. He lectured in German instead of Latin, so that barbers and bathkeepers could understand him. He is said to have burned the books of Galen and Avicenna publicly at the midsummer bonfire in front of his scandalized students, the 2 authors we have just spent 2 chapters admiring into the fire, because in his view, medicine had spent 1,000 years reading when it should have been looking. He was arrogant, quarrelsome, itinerant, frequently unemployed, and this is the uncomfortable part for everyone who has enjoyed disliking him. Right about a remarkable number of things. Chemistry belonged in medicine. Miners' diseases came from the mines. Wounds healed better clean than packed with ointments. And the dose makes the poison. Wherever he went, and he went everywhere, Basel to Salzburg, tramping between courts and towns with his sword and his temper, he carried his own remedies, secret ones, compounded by his own hand. And the one his followers whispered about, the one bound up with his legend, were the pills he was said to reach for when a case seemed hopeless. Pills his tradition called, with no modesty whatsoever, the stones of immortality. They were said to work wonders. And they were said, later, by the followers who wrote his legend down, to contain, beneath the gold leaf and the crushed pearls and the mystification, opium. Now, honesty compels the confession the series enjoys making. The recipes are murky, the reports are second-hand, and scholars still argue about what Paracelsus's own preparations actually contained. Some of what he called laudanum may have had little poppy in it at all. The legend is tidier than the ledger, as usual. But the legend is the point. Because it was through Paracelsus and his noisy disciples that a new idea entered European medicine. That opium was not one useful drug among hundreds, filed between the vinegar and the barley water, but the chief of remedies, the arcanum, the great secret, the thing a master physician reached for when it mattered. The quiet middle pages of the Pharmacopoeia were over. The poppy had a press agent, and the press agent's word for it stuck, laudanum. Where the word itself came from is, you will be entirely unsurprised to hear, also disputed. Some derive it from laudanum, an old resin, others from the Latin laudare, to praise, and the honest answer is that nobody is certain. Given what the next 2 centuries did with the stuff, to praise is at least the more truthful etymology, whether or not it's the true one. It took a calmer man to turn the legend into a medicine, and he arrived a century and a half later in London, wearing the plainest possible virtues. Thomas Sydenham was in nearly every way the anti-Paracelsus. Where Paracelsus stormed, Sydenham observed. An English physician of the 1660s and 70s, a friend of the philosopher John Locke. He built his reputation on patient, systematic bedside observation. Fevers watched through their whole course, epidemics charted season by season. And he became, by general agreement, the most respected physician of his age. They called him the English Hippocrates. And this careful, methodical, deeply unflashy man was opium's greatest advocate. His praise of it, in his published writings, is the sincerest a working doctor ever offered. Among all the remedies Providence had granted to ease human suffering, he wrote, none was so universal and so effective as opium. You will sometimes see a snappier phrase, God's own medicine, pinned to Sydenham. And in our house tradition, we must gently note that the snappy version is nowhere in his books. It seems to have been polished into quotability by later admirers, the way famous men are always being improved by their fans. What Sydenham actually wrote is longer and better. Without opium, he said, medicine would be crippled, and no honest physician of his century would have disagreed. There was almost nothing else on the shelf that reliably worked. It eased pain. It stopped the flux that killed. It brought sleep to the dying. In a medical world still bleeding and purging its patients, you remember the humoral theory from episode 1 and where it led. Opium was very nearly the only mercy in the bag. So Sydenham did the most useful thing a methodical man can do for a legend. He standardized it. His laudanum was a recipe. Published, repeatable, no arcana, no gold leaf. Opium, dissolved in good sherry wine, with saffron and cinnamon and cloves. Read that again slowly because it is one of the loveliest formulas in the old pharmacopoeia. Sherry, saffron, cinnamon, cloves. It sounds less like a drug than like Christmas in a bottle. And that was partly the point. The spices covered the bitterness. The wine carried the dose, and the whole was measured in drops, from a dropper with numbers a physician could write down and another physician could follow. Where Paracelsus had a secret, Sydenham had a recipe, and in pharmacy, the recipe wins every time. Sydenham's laudanum and its imitators went onto the shelf of every apothecary shop in Europe. One more glazed jar among the hundreds we walk past in episode 2, dispensed by the drum alongside the theriac and the syrups. The medical literature that grew up around the standardized drop makes wonderful reading, and one book deserves its moment by the fire. In 1700, a Welsh physician named John Jones published The Mysteries of Opium Revealed, the first full English book devoted to the drug, and it is the whole coming century in one binding. Jones praises opium for page after rolling page, in terms that would make a modern regulator faint. And then, in the same volume, with the same fussy thoroughness, he sets down one of the earliest clear clinical descriptions of what long use does, the need that grows and the distress, described organ by organ, that follows when a long accustomed dose is stopped. Praise in the front of the book, warning in the back, and no sense anywhere that the two halves might need to be reconciled, because to Jones and his century they didn't. Both were simply properties of the material, to be noted honestly, like Dioscorides noting the color of a flower. The 18th century knew, in print, by 1700, Nearly everything about opium that the 19th would be devastated to discover. It just filed the knowledge calmly and kept prescribing. And if that sounds like folly, hold the thought until you hear what was actually on the rest of the shelf. A doctor who gives up opium in 1700 is a doctor with almost nothing left in the bag. And there, for a while, the story rests, literally on a shelf in the shop we know so well. Through the late 17th and early 18th centuries, opium settled into European practice as the indispensable professional drug. The physician's books gave it whole admiring chapters. The apothecaries stocked it in a dozen forms. The debates about it were conducted in Latin between learned men at the stately pace of learned quarrels. Treatises were written on its virtues. Cautious voices, there were always cautious voices, noted the habituation that long use produced in the measured tones of men describing a professional inconvenience. It was, in short, a doctor's drug, handled at a doctor's distance. But a recipe, once published, does not stay in the consulting room. It was cheap. It was legal. It was easy to make and easier to sell, and no law anywhere said a druggist needed a physician's word to sell it, or a customer a physician's word to buy it. The 18th century was about to pick up Sydenham's tidy little bottle and carry it out of the shop and set it on the kitchen shelf of every cottage in England, next to the tea, which could cost more. What had been the physician's last mercy was about to become the people's first resort. And that change, quiet, gradual, entirely well-intentioned at every single step, is where the modern part of this story truly begins. Chapter 5: The People's Drug. Every chapter so far has kept the poppy in professional hands. Priests, physicians, pharmacists, the licensed and the learned. This chapter is different, and it is the hinge of the whole evening. This is the chapter where opium goes home with everybody. Walk into an English chemist's shop in, say, 1840. We toured this room in episode 2, the mahogany counter, the show globes, the rows of labeled drawers, and ask what you could buy for a penny. The answer in almost any town in the country included laudanum. No prescription. There were as yet no prescriptions in the legal sense. No questions beyond the shopman's discretion. A penny's worth of laudanum, 20 or 25 drops, sold as readily as tea or thread and sold everywhere. Not just at the chemist's, but at the grocer's, the draper's, the village shop that sold everything else. By mid-century, England was importing scores of tons of opium a year, and the overwhelming majority of it was drunk in drops by ordinary people, at home, for reasons that will break your heart precisely because they are so reasonable. Here's who was buying, and why. And this is the part of tonight's story we most want to tell carefully, because it is where the caricatures live, and the truth deserves better. The great customers of the people's opium eras were the poor, and what they were treating was their lives. Consider the man with a shattered tooth and no dentist within a day's walk, or the price of one within a month's wages. Consider the woman with what the age called rheumatism, the joint pain of a life of cold water and hard floors, for whom the entire remaining pharmacopoeia offered essentially nothing. Consider the laborers of the fens, the drained marsh country of eastern England, where the ague, the shivering marsh fever, was simply part of the climate, and where poppy-head tea was brewed at home from garden poppies and drunk the way other counties drank beer. The fens became famous for it, a whole English region quietly running on the poppy, not from vice, but from damp. Doctors cost money. Doctors for most of these people might as well not have existed. The penny bottle existed. It asked no questions, it required no appointment, and, unlike nearly everything else the age sold for pain, it worked. When we say opium was the people's drug, this is what we mean. It was the medicine of people who had pain and no other options, which was most people in most places for most of that century. The failure here, and one plain sentence will do, was never the weakness of the poor. It was a world that offered the poor a bottle instead of a doctor and then blamed them for drinking it. The trade, of course, organized itself around the demand with all the ingenuity of the age. And here the story fills with brand names, some of which you have met. There was Dover's powder, opium and ipecacuanha for sweating out a cold, whose inventor deserves his footnote read aloud. Thomas Dover, physician of Bristol, had in his adventuring youth sailed as a privateer, and on that voyage, in 1709, his crew rescued from a desert island a marooned Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk, the living original of Robinson Crusoe. The same man rescued Robinson Crusoe and invented the 18th century's favorite cold powder. And if that is not the best dinner party fact in tonight's episode, we will be surprised. There was Godfrey's cordial, opium, treacle, and spices. And there was Street's infant's quietness, and Atkinson's infant's preservative, and Mother Bailey's quieting syrup, and you will have noticed, with a chill, the market these names are aiming at. We spoke in episode 1 of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, the American teething remedy with morphine in it, and we promised then that its full context was coming. This is it. The infant's cordials were the era's most terrible bargain, and we will keep our camera exactly where it has been all evening. At a distance, on the shelf, on the label. The mothers and nurses who bought them were overwhelmingly exhausted working women dosing colic and teething and hunger with the only quiet the shop sold. The bottles were legal, respectable, and advertised with pictures of rosy sleeping children. And the trade knew, and the coroners knew, and the medical journals said so in plain print for decades, that the dosing was a lottery and the smallest customers sometimes did not wake up. One plain sentence, and then we move on. Of everything the unregulated bottle ever did, this is the thing the reformers could not forgive. And when the reckoning finally comes, a few chapters from now, the infant's cordials are a large part of why. And if you want the flavor of the trade at the counter itself, listen to the forms it took. Because the Victorian pharmacopoeia turned the poppy into an entire product line and the inventory reads, In our house tradition, like a lullaby, there was laudanum, the tincture, sold in drops. There was paregoric, camphorated tincture, gentler for coughs, spoon to children and the elderly alike. There were opium pills and opiate lozenges sold loose from jars like sweets. Opium plasters spread on brown paper and pressed to an aching back. Opiate liniments for rubbing. Opiate enemas, about which the less said the better at this hour. And the black drop, a vinegar preparation reckoned 4 times the strength of laudanum, for customers past the reach of ordinary drops. Every one of them stood on the open shelf of the shop we toured in episode 2, next to the tooth tinctures and the liver pills, wrapped in the same paper, rung up in the same till. The chemist who sold them was no cynic either. The good ones rationed their known regulars, refused the obviously desperate, and quietly watered the drops of customers they worried for. Small, private acts of stewardship, decades ahead of any law requiring them, performed at the same counter where the night bell hung. The shop, as ever in this series, was better than the system it stood in. It usually is. What strikes the modern reader hardest about all this is how unremarkable it was. This is the chapter with no villain in it. That comes next but one. The chemist who sold laudanum by the penny was not a corrupter. He was the most trusted man on the high street, the same figure we spent episode 2 admiring. The customers were not degenerates. They were the age's ordinary sufferers. Dependence was everywhere, and the age knew it the way an age knows things it has decided not to examine. The regular customers, the standing weekly orders, the elderly ladies of unimpeachable respectability whose drops were a fixture of the household ledger. Thomas de Quincey, whom we will meet properly in the next chapter, remarked without much exaggeration that he could name you a whole gallery of eminent men who took their opium as regularly as their dinner. It was, in the strictest sense, normal. And this is perhaps tonight's most useful lesson in how history actually feels from the inside. The great drug era of the 19th century did not feel like a drug era to the people living in it. It felt like the medicine cabinet. It felt like Tuesday. The catastrophes that announce themselves with trumpets are rare. The common kind arrive as a penny bottle, kindly meant on a kitchen shelf, one reasonable purchase at a time. By mid-century, then, the poppy had completed its long journey from temple to kitchen. Grown on 3 continents, praised by the greatest physicians of every age, standardized by Sydenham, retailed by the penny, and settled into the daily life of the Western world as deeply as tea or tobacco. Everyone drank from the same bottle. The laborer, the seamstress, the vicar's aunt, and the poets, especially the poets, because it was in exactly these years, in exactly this England, that a small circle of writers did something no one had ever quite done before. They wrote down, gorgeously at length, in the first person, what the inside of the bottle felt like, and in doing so they invented the drug memoir, glamorized the people's medicine into something stranger and darker, and gave the 19th century a new kind of famous man. The opium eater. The private, ordinary, kitchen shelf drug was about to acquire a literature. and with it, a myth we will need the rest of the evening to take apart. Chapter 6: The Confessions. In the autumn of 1821, readers of the London magazine opened their new issue to find an anonymous essay with a title like a whispered secret: Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Its author was a small, shabby, genteel, ferociously learned man named Thomas de Quincey, a bookseller's dream and a landlord's nightmare, who had run away from school, drifted through Oxford, befriended the poets of the Lake District, and settled into a life of brilliant essays and unpaid bills. He had first taken laudanum as a young man in London in 1804 for the most ordinary reason in this entire episode: a toothache. Face ache, he called it. Rheumatic pains of the head. On a rainy Sunday, on a druggist's ordinary recommendation from an ordinary shop for the ordinary price. You will recognize the story. It is the previous chapter, compressed into one customer. What was not ordinary was what he did 17 years later. He wrote it all down, beautifully, and signed the age's private habit with his own initials. The confessions were a sensation. Nothing like them had appeared in English. A first-person account, unrepentant and gorgeously written, of what the inside of the people's medicine actually felt like. De Quincey described his opium evenings the way other men described Italian journeys. The heightened music at the opera, the long dream architecture of the nights, whole cities and centuries unfolding behind his closed eyes. He called the drug, in one of literature's most reckless phrases, a just, subtle, and mighty power, and wrote of the years when it seemed to him nothing less than the secret of happiness, purchasable for a penny and carried in the waistcoat pocket. The reading public was electrified. The book was reprinted, pirated, imitated, translated. It made opium interesting in a way no pharmacopoeia entry ever had, and it has a fair claim to being the first drug memoir ever written, the founding document of a genre that has never since been out of print. And here, having summarized the famous half of the book, we will do what the 19th century largely declined to do and read the second half, because the confessions do not end at the opera. De Quincey structured his book honestly, the pleasures of opium, and then, at length, the pains. And the pains make hard reading even at 2 centuries' distance. He describes the years when the drug he had chosen stopped feeling like a choice, the doses that grew regardless of his intentions, the dreams that turned from palaces into oceans and burials, the mornings of a man who has discovered that the door he walked through so easily has no handle on the inside. We keep our distance, as we have all evening, and simply note what matters. He said it. Both halves. He told the century, in the same beautiful prose, that the just, subtle, and mighty power was also a landlord who never forgave a debt, and the century, having read both halves, chose to remember the palaces. That is not De Quincey's fault exactly. It is a lesson about audiences, and it may be the most modern thing in tonight's episode. People take from a confession the half they were already hoping to hear. The confessions did not appear out of nowhere. They came out of a particular circle, and standing just behind De Quincey, older, sadder, and far more gifted, is the circle's great cautionary figure, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, poet of the rhyme of the ancient mariner, philosopher, talker of legendary brilliance, had begun taking laudanum young, as everyone did, for illness and pain, rheumatic trouble, neuralgia, the standard miseries of a damp century. By middle age, the standing order had become the central fact of his life, the thing his friends managed, his letters lamented, and his enormous unfinished projects quietly documented. For his last 18 years he lived, by arrangement, in the household of a physician, who regulated the doses the poet could not regulate himself. Coleridge left us some of the most piercing sentences anyone has written from inside a dependence. Letters in which he begs correspondents to learn from him, describes his will as a captive of his own remedy, and holds both truths at once, that he was ill and needed relief, and that the relief had become the illness. Where De Quincey confessed with one eye on the audience, Coleridge confessed the way people actually confess, privately, repetitively, in grief. If the era's opium literature has a conscience, it is his letters. And of course, Coleridge is also the source of its most famous legend. The poem Kubla Khan, those 54 incandescent lines about the pleasure dome at Xanadu, came to him, he said, in an opium dream at a farmhouse in 1797. A vision of 200 or 300 lines complete, of which, upon waking, he had begun writing when he was interrupted by the infamous person from Porlock, a visitor on business who detained him an hour, and when he returned to his desk, the vision had gone. It is the best-known anecdote about creativity in the English language, and our house tradition obliges the footnote. The only source for the entire story is Coleridge himself, in a preface written 19 years after the fact, by a man with unfinished poem explanations to make, and a well-documented gift for them. Scholars have doubted every element, including the visitor. Perhaps it happened exactly so. Perhaps the person from Porlock is the most useful excuse ever invented. The poem, either way, remains. And so does the legend's real work, which was to weld, in the public mind, opium to genius. The idea that the drug did not merely comfort the artist but supplied the visions. That idea is the one piece of this chapter we most want to leave, gently but firmly, on the shelf of stories too good to be true. The visions were Coleridge's, the dome, the caverns, the damsel with the dulcimer. Those came from the most extraordinary reading mind of his generation. The drug took things from him, year over year, with compound interest. The century preferred to believe it had been paying him. The glamour was a lie the age told itself, and one plain sentence is enough. Opium never wrote a line of poetry. Poets did, sometimes for a while surviving their medicine. The circle was wider than these two, of course. The laudanum bottle stood on the writing desks of the age as commonly as the inkwell because it stood on everyone's desk. That was the last chapter's whole point. Elizabeth Barrett Browning took her drops for decades, prescribed from girlhood for pain and frailty, and managed, unlike her more famous colleagues in confession, to say almost nothing about it in public. Dependence, for a Victorian lady, being a thing one carried privately like the rest of one's health. Keats, a licensed apothecary before he was a poet, the only figure in tonight's story with a foot on both sides of the counter, filled his odes with the poppy's whole vocabulary, drowsy numbness and easeful death, written by a man who had dispensed the actual article. And Wilkie Collins, dictating the Moonstone through illness on heroic quantities of laudanum, reportedly claimed afterward that he could not recognize whole passages as his own work, a novel about a drug-induced act its doer cannot remember, written partly in a state its author could not remember. The 19th century did not lack a sense of irony, merely the will to act on it. The myth outlived them all. Through the century, the opium eater became a literary fixture, the doomed genius, the exquisite invalid. And the honest ledger of the thing sat unbalanced. For every waistcoat pocket rhapsody in print, there were the unglamorous multitudes of the previous chapter, the fens laborers and the dosed infants and the vicar's aunt, whose relationship to the same bottle generated no literature at all. Writers' habits made legend. Everyone else's made coroners' statistics. It is worth saying once, plainly, because it is still true of how we tell drug stories now. The famous confession is a lamplit corner of a very large, dark room. And while England was reading De Quincey by the fireside, this timing is the hinge on which tonight turns. England's merchants, 8,000 miles away, were loading chests of Bengal opium onto fast ships bound for the coast of China, in defiance of Chinese law, in quantities that dwarfed the entire domestic trade of the previous chapter, on behalf of the most powerful commercial empire on earth. The private bottle had a public ledger, and the ledger was about to produce the single darkest passage in the history of medicine's most storied plant. We have reached the part of the evening we promised to carry carefully. Take a breath. Settle a little deeper into the pillow. We are going to Canton. Chapter 7. The Two Wars. Every terrible thing in this chapter begins with a cup of tea. By the late 18th century, Britain was a nation that ran on tea the way later nations would run on oil. Millions of pounds of leaf a year, every ounce of it at that time grown in China. And China, to the lasting frustration of British merchants, wanted almost nothing Britain made in return. The Qing Empire regarded itself, with some justice, as self-sufficient. Trade was confined to the single port of Canton, under supervision, and the tea had to be paid for in the one thing China did accept: silver. Decade after decade, silver drained east, and London's merchants and ministers fretted over the imbalance in terms you have heard before. You may remember Pliny, in our apothecary episode, complaining that Rome's appetite for Eastern remedies was bleeding the empire of silver. 18 centuries later, the ledger had simply reversed direction, and this time the remedy for the trade deficit would be a remedy. Because there was one commodity China's customers would buy, in defiance of their own emperor, in quantities that grew every single year it was offered. The British East India Company controlled Bengal, and Bengal grew poppies, the very cultivation we watched arrive by the Silk Roads chapters ago, planted by physicians and now harvested by an empire. In the districts around Patna and Benares, the company organized opium production on an industrial scale. Licensed growers, collection agencies, factories where the drug was formed into standardized balls and packed, 40 to the chest, in mango wood cases. Each chest held roughly 140 pounds. Hold that image. The stacked chests, thousands upon thousands of them, in Calcutta warehouses, because the chest is this chapter's unit of account, and its numbers tell the whole story. 4,000 chests a year at the century's turn. 10,000 by the 1820s, 30,000 and more by the late 1830s. Millions of pounds of opium every year, moving toward a country whose law prohibited it. The mechanics had a lawyer's elegance, and one plain sentence will serve for judgment where the facts judge well enough themselves. The honorable company did not smuggle. It merely grew the opium, auctioned it at Calcutta, and averted its eyes as the private country firms ran it up the coast in fast-armed clippers to the smuggling depots off Canton, where Chinese brokers took delivery and silver came back down the chain. Everyone understood the arrangement precisely. It was designed to be deniable, and the deniability deceived no one, least of all the designers. The Qing court had prohibited the trade in edict after edict, 1729, 1799, and onward, and watched it grow tenfold anyway, watched the silver flow reverse, watched the habit spread inland from the coast. The medicine chest we left in China at the end of chapter 3 had become, through no doing of China's physicians, something else entirely. In 1838, the Daoguang Emperor decided on suppression in earnest, and chose for the task a man history has treated with steadily increasing respect. Lin Zexu, a scholar official of formidable ability and clean hands, with a reputation for incorruptibility rare enough to be remarked on. Lin arrived at Canton in the spring of 1839 and did exactly what he had been sent to do. He blockaded the foreign factories, demanded the surrender of every chest of opium in harbor, and got them. More than 20,000 chests, over 1,000 tons of the drug, the better part of a year's trade. And then, in June 1839, at Humen by the mouth of the Pearl River, he destroyed it. Not by fire, which would have left salvage, but methodically, in vast trenches flooded with water and salt and lime, the dissolving sludge flushed out to sea. The work of 500 laborers for 23 days, supervised and inventoried to the last ball. Lin, a scholar to his bones, paused first to compose a formal apology, a prayer to the spirit of the sea, asking forgiveness for what he was about to pour into it. and advising the creatures of the water, in effect, to keep clear for a while. History offers few gestures more quietly devastating. The man remembered as the great drug destroyer of the age stopping, mid-operation, to apologize to the fish. Lin also wrote a letter, and the letter is why his name belongs in an episode about medicine and conscience. Addressed to the young Queen Victoria, composed in the confident cadences of Confucian moral argument, it asked the simplest question in this entire evening. Your country prohibits this drug at home. Your law treats it as a harm to your people. By what right, then, do your merchants carry it to ours? Suppose men of another land brought such a thing to Britain for sale, the letter went on. How would your own government receive them? There is no record that Victoria ever read it. It went unanswered through official channels and reached the world instead through the press, printed in translation in the English language journals of the China coast and passed along from there, which means the sharpest moral document of the era was written, translated, published where any interested Englishman could find it, and changed nothing. Say it once, plainly. The question was never answered because it could not be answered. It could only be outgunned. And outgunned it was. The merchants' lobby pressed London for redress, for the seized property, for open trade, and in 1840 the expedition sailed. What followed was not, in any meaningful sense, a contest. Against the Royal Navy and vessels like the Nemesis, an iron-hulled steam warship that moved against wind and tide into rivers where no sailing ship could go. The Qing coastal defenses failed at every encounter. The fighting ran up the coast for 2 years, and it ended in August 1842, aboard a British warship anchored off Nanking. With the first of the agreements, China's historians would come to call the unequal treaties. The Treaty of Nanking opened 5 ports to British trade and residence. It levied an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, a sum calculated to cover, among other things, the value of Lin's destroyed chests, and it ceded to the British Crown, in perpetuity, a thinly peopled island at the Pearl River's mouth called Hong Kong. And here's the detail to hold in the dark tonight, the one that says everything about how empires write. In the entire treaty that ended a war begun over opium, the word opium does not appear. The trade that caused the war went unmentioned, unlegalized and uninterrupted, larger the year after the peace than the year before the war. A second war, fought through the late 1850s on slighter pretexts and with French participation, finished the work. More ports, foreign legations at the capital, and the ledger's final entry, the opium trade legalized at last, tariffed and regularized like any other commerce, an outcome the age called order. The trade ran on for another half-century, peaking in the 1880s, by which time China's own domestic poppy fields had grown to dwarf even the imports, the final, bitter economy of the thing. A prohibition broken so thoroughly, for so long, that the victim country ended by underselling its poisoners. The reckoning, when it finally came in the 20th century, would be driven partly by conscience, missionary reports, parliamentary campaigns, a royal commission, and eventually, in 1907, an agreement to wind the India trade down, and partly by the simple fact that the profits had thinned. One plain sentence, and we will let the harbor lights go dark for the better part of a century. The most advanced commercial civilization on Earth balanced its books on a drug it forbade to its own people, prosecuted 2 wars to keep the channel open, and called the arrangement trade. And no amount of Victorian respectability, then or since, has ever quite washed the salt and lime out of that ledger. We promised to carry this chapter at the pace of documents, and it has been documents all the way down. Edicts, auction lists, a letter, a treaty, an inventory of chests. That is deliberate, and not only for tenderness toward the hour. The opium wars are what the people's penny bottle looks like when it is scaled up to the size of empires and handed an armed fleet. The same substance, the same human appetite for relief, the same merchant's arithmetic, with nothing changed but the magnitude and the flag. The 19th century preferred a different picture of the Chinese opium story, though a smaller, smokier, more theatrical one. Set not in counting houses, but in lamp-lit dens, and peopled not with company directors, but with sinister strangers. That picture hung in the West's imagination for 100 years, and it was, in nearly every detail, a fiction, which makes it, for this series, irresistible. Let us go look at the opium den and see what was actually there. Chapter 8. 8. Smoke and Mirrors. In 1870, Charles Dickens published the opening chapters of what would be his final, unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. And its very first scene is set in an opium den in East London, a ruinous upstairs room, a tangle of sleepers, a bedstead, a pipe, and a respectable cathedral choir master waking among them with his secret life laid bare. 21 years later, Arthur Conan Doyle sent Dr. Watson into another one. The Man with the Twisted Lip opens in a den by the docks in the East End, all swirling smoke and shuffling attendants, where Sherlock Holmes sits disguised among the pipes. Between and after them came a whole literature and journalism of the den, guided midnight tours for magazine writers, lurid illustrations, the East End den as a fixture of the imperial imagination, dim, oriental, dangerous, a little door in London through which the fallen slipped out of England altogether. Here's what the records actually show. The London dens of the Great Panic were, essentially, a handful of small rooms in Limehouse by the docks, the natural quarter of a Chinese community that numbered, through most of the Victorian era, a few hundred people, most of them sailors. The establishments were social rooms as much as anything. Lodging houses where seamen ashore could smoke in the manner of home, roughly as respectable or disreputable as the sailors' pubs beside them, and considerably quieter. Police and parliamentary inquiries into the district found little to report. The neighborhood's actual vices were the same gin and poverty as everywhere else in Dockland. Set the numbers side by side, because the comparison is the whole chapter. A few hundred smokers in a few rooms in one riverside parish, against the tens of tons of opium the same city swallowed annually, as we saw 3 chapters ago, in penny bottles from respectable chemists in every parish in the country. The den was a rounding error in Britain's opium consumption. The medicine cabinet was the story. The century looked at the medicine cabinet, found it too familiar to see, and stared at the den instead, because the den had the inestimable narrative advantage of being someone else. Say the plain sentence once and gently, because it is load-bearing for everything that follows. The opium den panic was never really about opium. It was about the people smoking it. The pipe was foreign. The bottle was English. And so the pipe was a menace while the bottle was a remedy, though the bottle outsold the pipe 1,000 to 1. Victorian writers could describe a limehouse smoker in terms they would never have applied to the laudanum-taking dowager of the previous chapter, though the dowager's daily dose, drop for drop, may well have been the larger. The den was a mirror, the era angled carefully, so that the drug habits of an entire civilization appeared, in reflection, to be a small foreign room by the docks. Nowhere did the mirror do more work, or worse, than in America. San Francisco by the 1870s held the largest Chinese community outside Asia, men recruited by the shipload for the gold fields and the railroad, then blamed, with the economic downturn, for the wages and jobs of white workingmen. The city's anti-Chinese politics needed an emblem, and the smoking house furnished it. In 1875, San Francisco passed its ordinance against opium dens, commonly cited as the first anti-drug law in the United States, and aimed, as its supporters said in as many words, less at a substance than at a people. The stated terror was the respectable white youth lured into the Chinese quarter. Note the construction precisely, because it set the pattern. The law did not touch laudanum or the morphine setting quietly into American medicine cabinets. It touched smoking, the one form of the drug associated with the Chinese. Similar ordinances followed across the West, alongside exclusion laws that shut Chinese immigration altogether. One plain sentence, held at our usual distance. America's first drug law was aimed at a minority before it was aimed at a molecule. And the aim of drug laws has been a live moral question in every country, in every generation since. Tonight we simply note where the pattern began and carry it forward as fact. The theater, it must be said, was partly a paying concern, and here the story turns briefly, mercifully, comic. The den tour became a minor London industry, slumming parties of respectable gentlemen, journalists on assignment. Even distinguished foreign visitors were escorted through Limehouse by guides who knew exactly what the customers had come to see. And the little rooms, discovering their own legend, learned to perform it. There are accounts of proprietors keeping the establishment picturesque for the visitors' benefit, of the same few smokers obligingly viewed by party after party like exhibits, of writers ushered past a perfectly mundane lodging-house kitchen to the one authentically atmospheric bunk. The magazine-reading public wanted Mr. Dickens' den. House, ever obliging, supplied it, at a small consideration. Oscar Wilde completed the circuit in 1891 by sending Dorian Gray to the docks in fiction, to dens far more sumptuous and terrible than anything the actual East End could have staged. And the loop closed entirely. Novelists described dens they had toured. The tours were staged to match the novels, and the next novelist toured the staging. Somewhere at the bottom of it all were a few dozen tired Chinese sailors who had wanted a pipe and a bunk after 8 months at sea, and who found themselves, through no ambition of their own, cast, without audition or salary, as the century's favorite nightmare, the least deserved star billing in the whole history of the poppy. And the fiction kept compounding, as fiction does. Out of the den, panic grew one of popular culture's longest-serving villains, the sinister Oriental mastermind perfected in the Fu Manchu serials of the early 20th century, and a genre of melodrama in which the little room by the docks stood in for every anxiety the age preferred not to name in its own house. The imagery proved almost indestructible, the beaded curtain, the coiling smoke, the bunks in the lamplight. It outlived the dens themselves. Limehouse's rooms dwindled away with the sailor's trade, and it outlived the trade that had actually mattered, surviving into cinema and pulp fiction long after the last pipe went cold, a stage set still standing decades after the theater around it had been demolished. What makes The Mirror genuinely strange, one more turn, and it is the last, is what it left out on the other side of the world as well. In China itself, the reality behind the Western stage set was never the silken theater of the illustrations. It was, at the top of society, a costly habit of leisure, and at the bottom, the coolie's pipe at the end of a crushing day. The same poverty and pain economy as the Fens, laborers' poppy tea in different dress. The scale was genuinely terrible, as we saw last chapter. And Chinese reformers said so themselves in campaign after campaign. But the Western imagination took a national tragedy it had helped to supply, repainted it as an exotic vice, exported the image back out to the world, and then used that image to police its own minorities. It is the neatest closed loop of misdirection in tonight's story. The empire sold the drug, blamed the customer, feared the customer's countrymen at home, and passed its first drug laws against them, while the bottles on its own kitchen shelves went on outselling everything in the picture. The panic, in the end, was looking through the wrong end of every instrument it owned. The den was small and the cabinet was vast. The pipe was slow and the new hypodermic needle, already in the doctor's bags by the 1870s, was fast. The menace was dressed as a stranger, and the actual danger was wearing a white coat and a good reputation, and was, at that very moment, being refined into forms more powerful than anything a poppy field ever produced on its own. Because while the novelists were touring Limehouse, the chemists had been busy. Had been busy, in fact, since 1804, in the back room of a German pharmacy we visited at the end of our last episode. It is time to return to the workbench, and to the young man with the crystals, and to watch the 19th century do the thing it did best and understood last. Improve something until it becomes dangerous in entirely new ways. Chapter 9. The Alkaloid Age. Let us pick up a thread we left, quite deliberately, at the end of our apothecary episode, the young man in Paderborn. Friedrich Wilhelm Serturner was a pharmacist's assistant in provincial Westphalia. 20-odd years old, no university, no laboratory beyond the back room of the shop, who around 1804 set himself a question centuries of physicians had stepped over. Opium's effects were notoriously variable, batch to batch, patient to patient. Why? What if, inside the brown resin's tangle of substances, there was one particular ingredient doing the work? And what if you could get it out, pure, and weigh it? Working evenings, with shop glassware, he did exactly that. Teased from opium a crystalline substance, white and bitter, which scent dogs, and in the incautious tradition of his era, himself and 3 young friends, in a self-trial that by his own account went alarmingly further than intended, into profound sleep. He named it for what it did, reaching back, as we promised in Chapter 1. Past every king and chemist to the oldest filing system in the story. Morphium, for Morpheus, god of dreams. The myth had labeled the poppy first. The chemistry, 2,500 years later, countersigned. It is difficult to overstate what those crystals meant, and worth saying carefully, because this is one of the genuine hinges in the history of pharmacy. Serturner had shown that a plant's power could be a substance, isolable, weighable, dosable to the grain. Not an essence, not a humor, not a virtue of the herb. A chemical, in a bottle, the same in every bottle. It was the first time in history anyone had isolated an active ingredient from a medicinal plant. The alkaloids, this whole family of plant chemicals, came to be called. And once the door stood open, chemistry walked through it at a run. Within a generation, caffeine, nicotine, strychnine, and, as we told it in episode 2, quinine, pulled from the fever bark by Pelletier and Caventou in 1820. Modern pharmaceutical science has a birth certificate, and it was signed in the back room of a pharmacy by an assistant, after hours. The shop we spent all of last episode admiring had produced, from its own workbench, the thing that would eventually transform it beyond recognition. And the family firm that first manufactured the new crystals at commercial scale, from 1827, was a name from our last episode too. Merck, of Darmstadt, the angel pharmacy that became a company. Morphine was, in the most literal sense, pharmacy's own child. And for medicine, it was a gift with no precedent. Morphine was 10 times the strength of opium, and this was the miracle, consistent. A physician could finally know, to the milligram, what he was giving. Pain control became, for the first time, an instrument with markings on it. Then, at mid-century, the instrument acquired a point. Physicians in the 1840s and 50s, the Frenchman Charles Praves and the Edinburgh doctor Alexander Wood chief among them, developed the hypodermic syringe, and morphine dissolved in water could now bypass the stomach entirely and go directly beneath the skin. Relief in minutes from doses smaller than any draft. For surgery, for the deathbed, for the crushing pains that laudanum only blunted, it was the greatest advance in comfort medicine had ever made. And we should let that stand unironized for a moment, because every reader of this era's medical journals can feel the physician's honest joy. They had spent their careers largely helpless before pain. Suddenly, they were not. A footnote here, of the debunking kind this series collects. You will find it printed in respectable places that Alexander Wood's own wife became the first person to die from an injected overdose. It appears to be a myth. The cemetery records have her outliving her husband by more than a decade. One of those grim, tidy anecdotes that history keeps because it makes such a perfectly shaped warning. History rarely shapes its warnings that neatly. The real warning arrived wholesale instead. The American Civil War put morphine in the syringe through the largest field trial in history. Millions of doses, hundreds of thousands of wounded. And the post-war decades that saw morphine dependence become a recognized fixture of American and European medicine. The popular version, that the war minted an army of addicted veterans, the so-called soldier's disease, is, historians now caution, mostly a later legend. The phrase itself barely appears in the era's own writing. The documented pattern is quieter and closer to home. The typical morphine patient of the 1870s and 80s was not a veteran, but a middle-class woman dosed into dependence by her own physician, syringe and vial from the family doctor's own bag. The needle had made relief precise. It had made dependence precise too. And the profession knew it, wrote about it, worried about it, and reached for the century's standing answer to every drug problem it had ever created. Surely, somewhere in chemistry, there was a better molecule. All the mercy, none of the trap. Which brings us, with a heaviness the room can feel coming, to a laboratory in Elberfeld, Germany, in the summer of 1898, and to the most instructive pair of bottles in pharmaceutical history. The firm was Bayer, dye makers turned medicine makers. Their chemists, working through morphine's derivatives, settled on one first made in London back in 1874, diacetyl morphine. Morphine with 2 acetyl groups added. Tested, briefly by the standards of a later age, unbelievably briefly, it seemed a marvel. A cough suppressant of tremendous power, apparently effective at small doses, and believed, on the era's evidence, to be safer than morphine for the purpose, less of the narcotic drag, so the thinking ran. The firm's employees, the story goes, reported that trial doses made them feel heroic, and the marketing department gave the new cough medicine its own brand. Heroin. In the very same laboratory, in the very same August of 1897, 11 days apart, the same chemists had produced a second compound, a fever and pain remedy given the invented name aspirin, and the two went out into the world almost together, heroin to market in 1898. aspirin the year after, advertised in the same medical journals. Aspirin for fever, heroin for cough. Side by side in the price lists, 2 more bottles on the shelf of the shop we know so well, for tuberculosis patients, and the era was full of them, coughing toward death with nothing else on offer. A suppressant that powerful looked like plain mercy. Let the record be exact, because the legend has grown lurid enough without help. Bayer did not knowingly sell an addictive drug as an addiction cure. That framing came later from others, including physicians who tried heroin as a morphine substitute. The firm sold a cough remedy, it believed, on thin evidence to be safe, and stopped selling it. After mounting reports over roughly a decade, when the belief became untenable, say the plain sentence and move on. The truth needs no embellishment. The century's most careful chemical civilization took the strongest pain drug known, made it stronger, named it for heroism, and sold it for coughs because it wanted so badly to believe that this time the poppy had been tamed. Every era of tonight's story has had its version of that hope. Galen's theatrical theriac, Paracelsus's stones, Sydenham's tidy drops, the penny bottle, the precise little needle. The Alkaloid age simply pursued it with better tools, and so arrived, faster than any era before it, at the old pharmacon truth waiting at the bottom. Potency and peril are not 2 properties of this plant that chemistry might one day separate. They are one property. Purify the mercy, and you have purified the trap. By the century's end, then, the shelf held opium, morphine, codeine, another of the poppy's own alkaloids, isolated in 1832. And now heroin, in ascending order of refinement. The syringe sat in every doctor's bag. The penny bottle still stood on the kitchen shelf. And the sum of it all was a Western world more thoroughly medicated with the poppy than any society in history, with almost no law anywhere standing between any citizen and any of it. The 19th century had built, with the best intentions at nearly every step, a problem only the 20th century would name. And the naming, the laws, the ledgers, the locked cabinets, the long unfinished correction that runs right down to the counter where our own pharmacist stands, is the last chapter of tonight's story. The shop is about to get a book of poisons. Chapter 10. The Book of Poisons. There is a ledger we have opened twice before in the series, and tonight it opens for the last time. You remember the poison book, the register that Britain's Pharmacy Act of 1868 set on the chemist's counter. If you wanted arsenic for the rats, your name went in the book. The date, the substance, the purpose, your signature, witnessed by the chemist who now, by law, had to be a qualified and registered man. We admired it in episode 2 as the moment the friendly shop acquired a spine of law. What we did not dwell on then is that the 1868 Act schedule of poisons included, for the first time, opium in all its preparations. The penny bottle was still legal. Laudanum sat in the mildest schedule, and the trade fought to keep it there, but the principle had been stated, in statute, in ink. This substance is different. Someone qualified must stand between it and the public, and there must be a record. The kitchen shelf era did not end in 1868, but it was numbered from that day, and the number was written in the poison book. The corrections came slowly, then all at once, the way corrections do. In America, where the patent medicine industry we met in episode 1 was dosing the public with secret formulas, the soothing syrups, the consumption cures, the catarrh powders that were flatly cocaine, the reckoning arrived through journalism and Dr. Wiley's crusading chemists, and produced the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. It banned nothing. It did something quieter and, for this series, dearer. It made the label tell the truth. If your soothing syrup contained morphine, the bottle now had to say morphine on the front where a mother could read it. Sales of the opiate nostrums fell off a cliff. It turns out most customers, given an honest label, will decline to buy their infant an opiate, which is at once the most obvious and the most encouraging finding in tonight's whole story. Mrs. Winslow's, and everything like it, was finished as a respectable article. Honesty had done what a half-century of medical warnings could not. Then the world got a conscience about the larger ledger. In 1909, at American urging, the powers gathered, of all places, at Shanghai. In the very shadow of the trade we watched in Chapter 7 to confer on the opium question. The Hague Convention of 1912 turned the conference into treaty obligations, and nation by nation, the unthinkable became law. Britain wound down the India-China trade, and in 1914, the United States passed the Harrison Act. And here your narrator must be precise because the act is almost always misremembered. It was not, on its face, a ban. It was a tax and registration law. Every physician, pharmacist, and manufacturer dealing in opiates had to register, keep records, and dispense only in the course of professional practice. But in those bland clauses, the entire modern architecture was laid. The prescription as the only lawful gate, the doctor and the pharmacist as its keepers, the record book as its conscience. Within a decade, court rulings had hardened the tax law into prohibition of everything outside the gate. Heroin was banned outright in 1924, and by mid-century, layer by layer, culminating in the scheduling system of 1970, which ranks every controlled substance by risk and use. The descendants of the penny bottle had been gathered, every last one, behind the counter, behind a signature, behind a lock. The whole world, one plain sentence. In the span of a single lifetime, roughly 1868 to 1924, Western civilization went from selling opium to anyone with a penny to counting every grain of it in a government book, the fastest reversal of a settled habit in the history of medicine. And the book it chose for the counting was, in every meaningful respect, the chemist's old poison register, grown up. Not every country drew the gate in the same place, and the difference is worth a paragraph before we come home to the counter. Britain, facing the same question in the 1920s, convened a committee of physicians under Sir Humphrey Rolleston and arrived at a quieter answer than America's, where a doctor judged that a dependent patient could not be weaned. Maintaining them on a steady, supervised dose was legitimate medical practice. The problem filed under medicine, not under crime. The British system, it came to be called, and for decades the two great English-speaking approaches ran side by side like a controlled experiment. Same drug, same century. One country answering with the courtroom, the other with the consulting room. We are a sleep documentary, not a policy seminar, and the century of argument that followed is emphatically somebody else's episode. But the fork in the road belongs in tonight's story, because it is the same fork the whole evening has walked. Pharmacon, remedy and poison. Every age, and now every nation, deciding afresh which half of the word to write into law first. So let us end where the series always ends, and was always going to end tonight. At the counter, under the fluorescent light, with the person in the white coat who knows your name. Somewhere behind that counter, in every pharmacy in the land, there is a locked cabinet, steel, unglamorous, bolted down, and inside it are the poppy's children. Morphine still, after 200 years, because nothing has ever simply replaced it. Codeine, oxycodone and its cousins, the poppy's alkaloids retailored by chemistry, the little vials for the pumps and the patches. They are Schedule II in the American reckoning, the highest tier a medicine can occupy and remain a medicine. And around that cabinet the pharmacist performs every working day, a liturgy 4,000 years in the making, though it goes by the unlovely name of compliance, the counting twice against the ledger, the double-checked prescription with its unforgeable requirements, the record of every tablet in and out, reconciled to the grain, Dioscorides' honest 3 sentences expanded to a filing system, and the modern poison book itself, the prescription monitoring programs, statewide databases where dispensings are logged and checked, so that the pattern invisible to any single counter, the same drug, 5 shops, 3 towns, becomes visible to the system. It is the 1868 register, digitized. The pharmacist glancing down the page of signatures is the same professional gesture, the same, "Are you really what your label says you are?" aimed now not at the substance but at the situation. And on the shelf, this is new, and it is where tonight's story chooses to end. There is the antidote. Naloxone, a molecule shaped so like the poppy's own that it fits the same locks, but turns none of them. It occupies the door and opens nothing, and in doing so it can call a person back from the far edge of the very sleep this whole evening has circled. In our era, it sits at the front counter, no prescription needed. The age having relearned, at terrible cost, the oldest arithmetic in this episode, that where the remedy is abroad in every town, the antidote must be too. The pharmacist who dispenses the locked mercy with one hand and the open antidote with the other is not living a contradiction. She is living the pharmacon. The whole Greek word at once, remedy and poison held in the same 2 hands, with the training not to drop either. 4,000 years, and this is what arrival looks like. Not a cure for the poppy's doubleness. There is none. That was the first thing the myths knew. But a profession, patient and unglamorous and open late, built to hold it carefully. One plain sentence, the evening's last. The history of opium is the history of learning, slowly, at every scale from the temple to the empire to the corner shop, that some gifts can only be held with both hands, and the person who holds them for us, tonight, is standing under a fluorescent light somewhere, counting to 30 twice. And the flower itself? The flower never changed. It never had to. It is growing tonight in garden beds and farm fields from Tasmania to Turkey, the lawful crop that supplies the locked cabinet, and in 10,000 ordinary gardens where it is only a flower, silk petals, a green capsule nodding over the lavender, asking nothing. Every empire in tonight's story has risen and gone. The poppy is still exactly where Chapter 1 found it, in the first gardens we ever planted, holding its one strange gift and waiting, with perfect patience, to see what we will make of it next. There are worse companions for 4,000 years. There are certainly none more instructive. And that, dear listener, is very nearly the whole story, which means it is time to leave the garden. Come back out through the gate with me. Slowly. It's full dark now in the physics garden. The beds are just shapes, and the lead markers have given up their labels until morning. The poppies closed hours ago. They do that, you know. The petals fold at dusk, like hands, and the capsules stand in their rows in the dark, keeping their own counsel, the way they have outside Thebes and Baghdad and Bristol and 10,000 towns whose names nobody wrote down. We covered a great deal of ground tonight, and none of it will be on the test. The lake dwellers and their discreet mud, the juice with the barn cat name, Dioscorides and his 3 honest sentences, the emperor's careful doses, the golden city's sweet syrups, the stones of immortality, sherry, saffron, cinnamon, cloves, the penny bottle on the kitchen shelf, the dreamers and their beautiful, unreliable confessions, the chests and the letter nobody answered, and the man who apologized to the sea, the little room by the docks that a whole century stared at so it wouldn't have to look at its own medicine cabinet, the crystals named for the god of dreams, and the book, the plain, ruled, unglamorous book where the names go, which turned out after 4,000 years to be the closest thing this story has to a happy ending. If you're still awake, you have remarkable stamina, and we admire it. If you're somewhere in between, half in this garden, half in your own, that is exactly where you're supposed to be. Leave the heavy parts here. They've been carried a long time by professionals, and they'll be carried still when you wake. The gate is latching behind us now. The shop down the street is dark. The register is balanced, the cabinet is locked, and the person in the white coat has gone home to sleep, same as everyone. The poppies will open again at first light, red silk over the lavender, just flowers. The rest, as always, is history. Good night.